Erev Tov, it's wonderful to see everyone here in the sanctuary, and I understand we have about 200 screens joining us on the live stream as well, and it's wonderful to have you all here with us virtually tonight for our program with Yossi Klein Halevi. You know, this last Shabbat we read Parshat Lech Lecha, and we're in the midst of reading the stories in the Torah about the journeys of Abraham and Sarah and founding of the Jewish people. And we know that first call to Abraham and Sarah was Lech Lecha, to go out from your land to a place I will show you, Asher Ar'eka. And we know that place is the land of Israel. Abraham and Sarah don't seem to quite know that just yet at that moment, but they will very soon. But it's that formulation in the Torah, Asher Ar'eka, the place that I will show you, that I think has particular resonance not only in thinking about how we understand Torah, but also how the Torah helps us understand our world today. We know that the land of Israel, the state of Israel, is something that is built into our DNA. That's why we make it such a central part of our mission and our programming here at TBS, taking many Israel trips, having many programs about Israel, supporting AIPAC and Israel Bonds, Masorti Movement, and many, many other organizations in Israel with whom we've developed wonderful partnerships over the years. Just out of curiosity, how many of you here, and on the live stream, we can see you too, raise your hand if you visited Israel. Right? I think we got everyone in the room, just about, right? Pretty incredible when we think about that in relation to American Jewry. And this symbolizes our commitment that we have here to Israel. And our conversation tonight with Yossi Klein Halevi, one of the real thought leaders in helping us think about Israel today and our relationship as American Jews with Israel, is something that's part of our ongoing commitment with our Jewish state. These conversations will continue. You'll see a flyer on the tables on the way out with our partners this evening, JCRC, and we have David Snyder here with us tonight. There's David, the executive director of the JCRC. Is a program with Rabbi Danny Gordis on November 15th that you can find out about. And also we're happy here on March 27th to announce we'll be welcoming Mati Friedman as part of a lecture in memory of Jack and Thelma Hillebrand, Zichronam Livracha, to also continue that conversation about Israel. We do this because we know that Israel is central to who we are as Jews and central to who we are as lovers of our tradition. And tonight, we are very grateful for all of those who helped us make Yossi's visit here possible. To our supporters, to Gigi and Brad Schwartz, to the Greenberg family in memory of Jerry Greenberg and David Eisenhofer, to Doctors Jonathan and Lori Winter, who we're happy they helped bring their cousin Yossi here with us as well today, to the Levinson family in memory of Roy Levinson, to Scott Becker, and to Julie and Gregg Bannett. All of you, we're very grateful for your support in helping make tonight happen. And also, once again, I want to thank David Snyder and the JCRC for all of their help. And we're also very happy to welcome, there we are, welcome this evening as well with us, Pastors Jonathan and Camille E. Lyth, who are here from the Converged Church in Morristown, who are with us tonight as well. And it's wonderful to have you here at TBS in our sanctuary. And we hope that we can build off your visit tonight and develop more of a relationship with you and with your community. So thank you for being here this evening. I also want to thank Michelle Haseet-Waxman for all of our hard work in helping pull this night together, and Alex Weinberg and Steve Bornstein for their work as well in helping us with our live stream, and Laura Podursky in our office who helped make everything happen. And now to our speaker. Yossi Klein Halevi is someone whom many of us have spoken about bringing him here for many years. I've had the privilege of learning with Yossi as part of programs with AIPAC, as well as the Shalom Hartman Institute, and also through the wonderful podcasts he does with the Hartman Institute as well, that I am a regular religious listener to as well. And his insight, his thoughtfulness, and his perspective on some really tough issues that we're facing today as American Jews on college campuses, with Israel, politics, is something that has greatly helped me articulate and think about my own relationship with Israel and how we can help work to keep that strong. So Yossi, in addition to being a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, he also co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was a New York Times bestseller and has been published in Arabic and soon will be published in Hebrew. And it will be on sale in the Friedman Social Hall after his talk this evening, where Yossi will be available for book signings as well. And you're all invited to head to the Friedman Social Hall for some desserts, as well as having a book signed or purchasing a book from Yossi if you would like. He's also the author of other books such as Like Dreamers, which was named the best book of the year by the Jewish Book Council of America. And he writes many articles for American newspapers and magazines and is a sought-after lecturer. He was originally from Brooklyn, and he earned his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and an MS in journalism from Northwestern. He was an early activist in the Soviet Jewry movement, and in 1982, Yossi made Aliyah and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who is with him here this evening, and we're very happy to welcome Sarah as well to TBS this evening, and grateful that she can be here too as part of Yossi's visit, along with their 3 children. And the way it'll work is Yossi's going to speak for, I won't say how much time, so no one's watching the clock. He'll speak for a little while, and after that, Rabbi Wexler and I will go around with microphones and have a chance to engage in conversation and dialogue with Yossi before we conclude the evening by heading into the Friedman Social Hall. So ladies and gentlemen, Yossi Klein Halevi.
Thank you, Rabbi Peltz, for really an extraordinarily warm welcome. And as you just heard, I have family in this community. Jonathan and Laurie, my cousins, and their children, Sarah and David, who are with us here tonight. And Jonathan's mother, my Aunt Magda, who is watching from remote. And hi, Aunt Magda, I miss you. And that is actually a good way to segue into my topic tonight, because really what we're here to talk about is family. We're here to talk about the nature, the increasingly complicated nature of the Israeli-American Jewish relationship, which at times resembles a dysfunctional family. And so part of my intention tonight, perhaps, is to do a little collective therapy and to unpack the issues, why we've reached this point, and how we might be able to turn crisis into opportunity. When I speak about the Israeli-American Jewish relationship, I'm really speaking about 2 parts of myself. I've internalized this relationship. I am this relationship. I grew up in Brooklyn. I was educated here. I was nurtured by the American Jewish community. I moved to Israel in 1982 with Sarah. And for most of my career, I've been writing for American Jews. I've been writing for you. And I always felt that I was a kind of a translator between these 2 great Jewish communities. And when I first moved to Israel, I had this sense of going forth as one of the Israelite spies to spy out the land. And I felt almost as if my community was dispatching me. Go to the state of Israel and see what's actually happening over there. You're a journalist. Go figure this out and send us back reports. And I hope that my reports were more useful and more favorable than the report of the Israelite spies in the desert. But I say all this because I'm really coming, when I speak to you, I'm leaving my home in Jerusalem and coming, in a sense, to my home among American Jews. And so the difficulties in our relationship are really tearing me apart. And nothing worries me more about the future of the Jewish people than the future of this relationship. And when we speak about the American Jewish-Israeli relationship, we're really speaking about the future of the Jewish people. Because between us, between Israel and American Jewry, we are 90% of the Jewish people. Yes, there still is a diaspora, thriving diaspora in other parts of the world, But take Europe, for example. My strong feeling is that Jewish communities in Europe are in decline for various reasons, and that perhaps by the end of this generation, we may find an even greater concentration of world Jewry into these two centers, into Israel and into North American Jewry. And so what is at stake in trying to get this relationship right is nothing less than the future of the Jewish people. My starting point in assessing our relationship is celebratory. I celebrate the extraordinary achievements of the two flags on the bima. We tend to take for granted these two flags. I know I did growing up. The two flags in my synagogue I just thought were decorative in some way. And I now realize that the post-Holocaust American Jewish community had a profound intuition, which is that these two symbols, these two flags, were really the symbols of the rebirth of the Jewish people. And in that sense, they really do belong on the bima. They belong flanking the Torah arc, because these flags represent something sacred in our history, in our story. And I no longer take for granted the presence of these flags, especially because, as we know, both of these flags are each in its own way in trouble. Each of these flags represent countries in profound turmoil, countries that are deeply challenged in various ways. And beyond that, the two flags together, the American Jewish-Israeli relationship, is itself in turmoil. We increasingly don't know how to understand each other. Increasingly, we're speaking very different Jewish languages. Now, to some extent, this is really inevitable. And the problem in mutual perception begins with geography. American Jews live in what is still, despite everything, the safest, most welcoming diaspora that Jews have ever experienced. And as a result of that, the American Jewish community has rightly developed strategies of flexibility and openness to its environment, to its welcoming environment. We in Israel have lived under the very opposite circumstances. We've lived in a region that rejected our right to be there, that rejected our existence, that may be changing. There are some very significant signs of change. But for the better part of the last 100 years, we have lived under siege. And so the Israeli response to our environment has been deterrence, not openness, the opposite of openness. We have tried to deter our hostile environment. And in a sense, the genius of Jewish adaptability, the genius of Jewish survival, is being expressed by these two very different, even opposing strategies that are the right strategy for each community's circumstance. The problem comes into play when we start to have a Jewish conversation, because as a result of our very different circumstances, in our case, living under relentless hostility, in your case, living under more or less relentless welcome, the result of these very opposing circumstances is that we have developed a different set of priorities in our Jewish commitments, in our Jewish language, in the way that we speak about Judaism. Ask most American Jews, I think, certainly most American Jews from liberal denominations, What are some of the core issues that define your Jewishness? And Tikkun Olam, I would guess, would be very close to the top. In many cases, perhaps the first response, social justice. Ask Israelis about Jewishness and social justice, and they won't know what you're talking about. The average Israeli response will be, what does Jewishness have to do with social justice? Any person, every human being, needs to be responsible for social justice. What makes Jewishness, the particularistic expression of Jewishness, lead you to social justice? Why do you need Judaism for social justice? Any religion, any common sense will lead you to that conclusion. And so ask Israelis what defines their Jewishness, and they'll answer in very practical ways. Defending the state of Israel, serving in the army, observing holidays, feeling a sense of kinship with Jews around the world. Very practical. You know the joke in the American Jewish joke, a congregant comes to his rabbi and says, Rabbi, how do you say Tikkun Olam in Hebrew? Because it's become so much a part not only of American Jewish discourse, but of American discourse. Tikkun Olam is not an expression in modern Hebrew. We don't use it. The only time I hear Tikkun Olam invoked is here in America. So not only have we necessarily developed different concepts of Jewishness, we've also developed different needs. We have very different obligations, and we also have very different ideas of threat. And if you want a metaphor for what has come to divide, I would say most American Jews from most Israeli Jews, I would begin with Presidents Obama and Trump. Now, for American Jews, understandably, most American Jews, 80%, 75%, President Obama was a historic opportunity for healing America's deepest wound. And I'm very proud of American Jews for their support for Obama. And the perception of American Jews about Trump, which I largely share, is that he was an existential threat, literally an existential threat, to the liberal order that has allowed American Jewry to become the most successful diaspora in Jewish history. Ask Israelis how they perceive Obama and Trump, and you will suddenly be stepping into the mirror. And Israelis, and here I certainly share this perception, Israelis saw the Obama administration's Iran deal as the single greatest security threat that we have faced since the Six-Day War. I have a friend who was in government in Israel, and he said, and when I said this to him, I said, I feel this is May 1967, the weeks leading up to the Six-Day War. He said, you're wrong. It's 1948. And that was the debate in Israel. Is this a 1948 moment or a May 1967 moment? And that is a perception, incidentally, that is shared by many Arab leaders. It was the basis, in fact, the Iran deal was the basis for the Abraham Accords, that shared sense of threat toward Iran and, frankly, of betrayal from America. Arabs and Israelis came together against Obama's Iran deal. As for Trump, Trump restored Iran as the regional threat. One can argue whether his strategy was successful or not, but he certainly was the most forthcoming American president that we've ever experienced in terms of Israel's agenda. And so we now come to a moment where these two flags, which when I was growing up were naturally seen as being endemically in harmony, are increasingly in a tense relationship. I remember as a kid, we used to speak, my friends and I, whose side will you be on if Israel goes to war with America? And it was just, then we would quickly realize it's impossible. It's a ludicrous conversation. Now, I do believe that that's impossible, but serious strain in the relationship is certainly no longer inconceivable. The biggest divide between American Jews, and increasingly young American Jews in particular, and the state of Israel, is, of course, the ongoing occupation of the Palestinians. And the anguish that I hear when I speak on campus, when I speak to young American Jews, the anguish which I resonate with is, how can we, of all peoples, find ourselves in a situation of seemingly permanent occupiers over another people? How can we be denying to another people what we claim for ourselves, the right to national self-determination? And half of me agrees, but there's another half of me that says that's not the whole story. What I, as an Israeli, need from American Jews to understand is that even though Israel is today the undisputed power in the Middle East, one can still be a powerful country and nevertheless experience acute vulnerability. Vulnerability is not powerlessness. Israel is not powerless. We are by no means a victim. We give better than we get. That is a basic Israeli doctrine shared by left, right, and center in Israel, that when we are under threat, what we give in return is greater than the threat itself. And that's what has kept us safe all these decades. But nevertheless, one can still be vulnerable. And Israel is acutely vulnerable. There's no country that I can think of anywhere that lives with the cumulative threat that we live with on a daily basis. Look at our borders. We have Hezbollah in the north, and now we have Iranian Revolutionary Guards in Syria. We have Hamas in the south. I live in a neighborhood called French Hill, which is the very edge of northeast Jerusalem. Some of you know it. It's next to Mount Scopus. And Sarah and I live in literally the last row of houses in French Hill. From our porch, you can see 3 political entities without binoculars. There's the sovereign state of Israel, which ends outside our window. The West Bank, Judea and Samaria, begins on the next hill. The Palestinian Authority a little further in the distance. And in the farthest distance is the Kingdom of Jordan, whose lights we see clearly at night. You can traverse these 3 political entities within an hour. That's the intimacy, I would say almost the unbearable geographical intimacy of this area. And so when I look out my window and I see Palestinian villages on the next hill, the question that I ask myself is, if there's going to be a Palestinian state, will I have Gaza literally on the next hill? Now, I want a Palestinian state. I need, as an Israeli, I need a Palestinian state. I need a Palestinian state to preserve Israel as a Jewish majority state and as a democracy. for all the reasons that we all know. After 50 years of debate between left and right, there's not that much new insight to add here. But what I learned very early on as an Israeli is to listen to both the left and the right, and to internalize the legitimate arguments of both sides. And so I learned to listen to the left argument that if the occupation continues indefinitely, we will come to that point, and we may not be far from that point, where we will have to choose, make an impossible choice between the two non-negotiable identities on which the state is founded: Israel as the state of the Jewish people, Israel as a democratic state, as the state of all of its citizens. And that is a dilemma that we must forestall. But then I also listen to the arguments of the right, which is, what's going to happen on the hill across from your porch? Is it going to be a benign Palestinian state? Or will we have one more hostile border? And in this case, the most dangerous of our borders, because the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, call it what you will, borders Israel's major population centers. And if we create a hostile state on that border, we may not be able to defend ourselves. We are the only occupiers that I can think of who worry that if we withdraw from territory, we will not only be diminished territorially, but we may not be able to adequately defend ourselves in the most dangerous region on the planet. And so, in internalizing the arguments of the right and the left, I gradually came to realize that I belong in the political center. And in the early years of our living in Israel, in the 80s and the 90s, being a centrist was a very lonely place, because the political debate was really left versus right. And I used to vote for these little centrist parties that would rise and fall, disappear after one election, until the second Intifada, those terrible 4 years of the suicide bombings. What happened in the second Intifada was that the Israeli left collapsed, completely disintegrated. We have what's left of the left is represented by two small parties, Meretz and, astonishingly, the Labor Party, which was once the pillar of Israeli politics and is now a minor party, one of the smallest in the Knesset. The second Intifada all but destroyed the credibility of the Israeli left, and what came in its place was the center. And now today we have two very strong centrist parties. First is Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, There Is a Future, and the second is Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party. And so the Israeli political map today is no longer divided between right and left, but right and center. And this, for me, personally, has been a great relief and a kind of vindication. And more Israelis would agree with the centrist formulation, the way that I would put it, about a Palestinian state, which is that a Palestinian state invokes in me two nightmarish scenarios. The first nightmare is that there won't be a Palestinian state and the occupation continues indefinitely. The second nightmare is that there will be a Palestinian state and we may not be able to defend ourselves. So the first thing that I need American Jews to understand about my predicament is the soul of a centrist. How we can agree, we can agree about the dangers of the occupation. We can agree that a two-state solution in principle is the best solution for Israel, but in practice, I dread that outcome. And what I need from American Jews are partners in anguish, partners in struggle. What I don't need are easy answers, whether they come from the right or from the left. I need partners who will struggle with me and who will appreciate the impossible situation that we're in, where whatever we do is going to have potentially severe consequences. That's Israel's real dilemma. I'm tempted to use the word tragedy. Now, what I'm not looking for from American Jews is a pass. I'm not looking for American Jews to agree with everything that every Israeli government says or does. I'm looking for partners who will critique Israeli policies when necessary. Again, whether you come from the left, right, or hopefully the center, to recognize that the uncritical relationship of the early years is over, and that's a positive development in our relationship. We are maturing, hopefully, in our relationship. And, you know, when I speak about Israel on campus, I emphasize how the Palestinian national movement rejected every peace offer that was ever on the table. I can't think of another national movement that has rejected offers for statehood as consistently as the Palestinian national movement. We have always said yes, they have always said no, but something changed under the Netanyahu government. In the last 12 years, we stopped placing credible peace proposals on the table. The last credible Israeli offer was in 2009 with Ehud Olmert. Now, do I believe that if Israel placed the same offer on the table today, we would get any different response from the Palestinian leadership? I don't. Do I believe that if the Meretz party, the most left-wing of the Jewish parties, was in power, that we would have peace? No. Nevertheless, I believe it's our responsibility to continue to pursue peace. And there's a wonderful verse in the Torah, Bakesh Shalom Verodfehu. Seek peace and pursue it. And it's a very strange verse, because why pursue? Why not? It's enough to simply say, seek peace. And my little political interpretation on that is that sometimes that you seek peace when peace is possible. You pursue peace when it's not possible. You keep the goal of peace alive in your being. And that's what we stopped doing in these last 12 years. We stopped pursuing an admittedly impossible peace, but we are not absolved, first of all, as Jews, and secondly, by the fact that we're occupying another people. We are not absolved from the commandment to pursue peace, however elusive. But when I invite American Jews to critique Israel, and I am actively inviting American Jews to be full partners, and full partners means criticize us as vehemently as we criticize ourselves, and no one criticizes Israel more vehemently than Israelis. Be involved in the inner workings, understand Israeli society, celebrate our achievements, and critique our failures. But to do so with nuance, to do so with an appreciation of the complexities in which Israel is caught, and not to forget that we're in a war also not only in the Middle East, also here. We're in a war for the good name of the Jewish people, for the good name of the state of Israel. And that American Jews, I would argue, need to learn to speak two languages on Israel simultaneously. One is a language of defense, and the other is a language of critique. And increasingly what's happening is that the community is dividing between Jews who know how to speak only one of these two languages. What we need are not one-dimensional Jews who can only hold one truth about Israel in their minds. We need multi-dimensional Jews who are capable of a nuanced partnership with Israelis. This past spring, as you all know, we went through what is, to my mind, the single worst moment that I can recall in Israel's relationship with large parts of American society, including large parts of the Jewish community. The war in Gaza was condemned in ways that I don't recall in the past. And so the question is why? And this was something that really puzzled many Israelis, because the irony is that with each one of our conflicts in Gaza, each successive conflict, the army actually learns how to keep civilian casualties to a minimum. The IDF actually performed this in this conflict far better than in previous conflicts, and yet it was condemned more vociferously than ever before. And the question is why? And my strong sense is that the reason for that is that what immediately preceded the fighting in Gaza was the incident in Sheikh Jarrah. The families in Sheikh Jarrah who were threatened with displacement by a settlement group. And without going into the question of Sheikh Jarrah, I think there's a larger issue at stake here. And that is that Israel finds itself in an increasingly impossible situation in terms of our image in the world. And the reason for that is that every few years we are forced to fight asymmetrical wars. And we have no, and I say forced because we have no choice but to fight periodically against Hamas, against Hezbollah. We're fighting against Iranian Revolutionary Guards literally every third day. There's a war going on now between Israel and Iran in Syria. And that can erupt at any time into something larger, more regional. If we're going to continue to expect, we in Israel, continue to expect understanding and support from our friends around the world, we need, when we fight these asymmetrical conflicts, and asymmetrical wars are by definition ugly wars. You have a standing army fighting against terrorists who are embedded in a civilian population, and there's no way to prevent hard incidents from happening, tragic incidents. That is the nature of an asymmetrical conflict. If we expect our friends to stand with us when we periodically go to war against these terror groups on our borders, we need to continue maintaining our credibility as reluctant occupiers. We can't be both occupiers and fighting asymmetrical wars at the same time. It doesn't work. And so to maintain our credibility as occupiers, as reluctant occupiers, who are occupying only because we don't yet have a peace partner on the other side, but who would withdraw if we had a credible partner, that will require restraint in settlement building. It will require an active reaching out to the Palestinians with peace proposals that can continue to be spurned. But in that way, we maintain at least our credibility. We cannot maintain our credibility on the front of asymmetrical war while continuing to pursue a frankly annexationist policy. And so what I need from American Jews is a reminder of some basic facts of life. We can't go to war with Gaza and evict families in Sheikh Jarrah at the same time. Doesn't work. And tell us that. Tell us what your experiences are here. We need to hear from you how to defend ourselves in the court of world opinion. Now, until now, I've been focusing on what I, as an Israeli, need from you. Let me turn the tables and offer some thoughts about what Israelis need to understand about American Jews. Because this relationship, if it's really going to deepen, it must become truly reciprocal, and it has never been reciprocal. And my starting point is that Israelis and the Israeli government need to begin respecting the authenticity of the forms of Judaism that American Jews have created. Not just respecting, but celebrating. And for 70 years, 70 plus years, the state of Israel has shown contempt for American Jews. And much of that contempt, I would argue, is unintentional. And the reason why Israel has not endorsed Jewish religious pluralism, the reasons are complicated. But one of the reasons, and I think it's important to understand this, is that the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews came from families with origins in countries where there was no Jewish religious pluralism. Neither in Eastern Europe nor the Middle East, which is where the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews come from, there was no religious pluralism. There was political pluralism, ideological pluralism. Religious pluralism was unknown. In Eastern Europe, you were Orthodox or you were secular. And so most Israeli Jews, most secular Israeli Jews, carried that memory into Israeli society and saw no need for religious pluralism. And so that's why I say that much of the insult against the American Jewish community was unintentional. The problem is that in recent years it has become increasingly intentional. And that's because of the rise of the ultra-Orthodox, who have made the war against religious pluralism a linchpin of their political identity. And the disgrace of the Israeli majority is to have handed the keys to Judaism to the most intransigent group within the Jewish people. That part of the Jewish people, the ultra-Orthodox, who feel the least sense of commitment to what we call Klal Yisrael, the totality of the Jewish people. I see that not only as a crime against democracy, but I see it as a crime against Zionism. The promise of Zionism to the Jewish people was to create a public space that would reflect the totality of the Jewish people. In this case, we have failed. And this is a joint struggle that, admittedly, unfortunately, still only a minority of Israeli Jews are committed to, but I believe it's a growing minority. This is a generational struggle. It will take a long time, but we need to really be fighting this struggle together. Another 10 minutes, okay? I also need you as allies to strengthen Israeli democracy. Israeli democracy, before getting to the problems, what we need to say up front about Israeli democracy is that it's a miracle. There is no other democracy that I can think of that was born in war and has never known a day of real peace other than Israel. And factor into this one wave after another of refugees coming from non-democratic societies, societies without any democratic tradition, coming into a permanent pressure cooker. not only has Israeli democracy survived these last 70 years, but I would argue that in many cases, our democratic institutions have been strengthened. And so I see Israeli democracy as a laboratory I see Israel as a laboratory for democracy under extremity. What happens when democracy is placed under relentless pressure? How does it respond? And in that sense, the cracks in Israeli democracy are as instructive as our successes. But when I say that Israeli democracy is a miracle, I'm not only celebrating, I'm also expressing a certain anxiety. Because a miracle is a defiance of the laws of nature. You can't take a miracle for granted. A miracle has to be nurtured. And in recent years, what we have seen happening in Israel, from the very top, from the prime minister downward, was the very opposite of nurturing. Now, it may be difficult for you here in America to imagine a political leader who attacks his own country's democratic institutions and ethos. But as difficult as it is for you to imagine, we experienced that in Israel in the Netanyahu years. And we have begun to see serious cracks in the commitment of many Israelis to Israel as a democratic state. And we need, in our partnership, we need your help in strengthening Israeli democracy, especially in strengthening our relationship with the Arab-Israeli minority. We need your wisdom in navigating majority-minority issues. The Jewish people, as it turns out, hasn't had a whole lot of experience being a majority in the last few thousand years, and it shows in our insecurity in our relationship with the Arab minority. Now, there are good reasons for mistrusting certainly much of the Arab-Israeli political leadership. Some Israeli Arab leaders have committed what I would regard as acts that are close to treasonous. But if you look at the polls, an overwhelming majority of Arab Israelis want to be part of the Israeli mainstream. Something like 55% of Arab Israelis say they're proud to be Israeli citizens, which is a real foundation to build a relationship on. What we're seeing today in Israel for the first time, and this is something that I'm thrilled about, we have a party, an Arab party, that's part of the government. And so what we need is we need to deepen our partnership in strengthening the Arab-Israeli connection to mainstream Israel. My understanding of Israeli identity, and this comes out of a reading of Israel's Declaration of Independence, is that Israel is based on two non-negotiable identities. And I mentioned these two identities briefly earlier. The first is that we are the state of the Jewish people, of all Jews, whether or not you're a citizen of Israel. The second is that we are the state of all of its citizens, whether or not you are Jews. These are two very complicated identities to hold together. Nevertheless, if you erase or weaken one or the other, you do irreparable violence to the essence of Israel. Last two quick points. They're really not quick points, but I will try to condense them. Is the question of the rise of anti-Zionism in progressive spaces and what this means for American Jews. What we are experiencing is a war against the Jewish story. That's really what the war against Israel's right to exist is about. It is a war against the post-Holocaust Jewish recovery. And when you declare war on the legitimacy of the Jewish story, you're declaring war on the essence of who we are, because we are our story. It's not a coincidence that the seminal Jewish ritual that unites most Jews is the Passover Seder. More so, I would argue, at least in Israel, than fasting on Yom Kippur. And the reason for that is Passover is when we get together to try to understand what does this story mean that we've been carrying for 4,000 years. And so the assault on Israel's legitimacy is a war on our essence. I fear that BDS and anti-Zionism is actually a greater threat to the well-being of American Jews than it is to Israel. Israel is going to weather this threat. We are adept at dealing with boycott. We've lived with an Arab boycott for 70 years. The BDS has so completely failed in its goal of isolating Israel that while it's true that Ben & Jerry's will no longer sell in the West Bank, Israeli high-tech companies doubled their foreign investments this year, and the year isn't over yet. An unprecedented investment in the Israeli high-tech sector. And that, in all likelihood, is just going to keep, God willing, keep growing. When I say that anti-Zionism is a threat to the American Jewish community, it threatens the great achievement of American Jewry in the last 2 generations. And that achievement was winning unconditional acceptance from American society. Jews in the last 2 generations have been able to define themselves in any way that you choose to. You can be Chabad Jews, you can be assimilated, you can define yourselves in any way, and America will accept you. It was certainly not the case in the past. In order to become fully part of America, there was a trade-off. Jews had to give up certain Jewish traits, like the trait that I'm demonstrating now. Jews had to be less Jewish. In the last 2 generations, you could be as Jewish as you want. That is an extraordinary victory of American Jewry. What is happening today is the return of American Jewish conditionality in progressive spaces. To be accepted today in progressive America, increasingly, you need to repudiate Zionism. You need to prove that you are what used to be called a good Jew, not like the other Jews. And the moment you start playing that game of you're a good Jew, unlike the others, you are back in a classic mode of minority Jewish status. And that is the real threat, to my mind, of BDS and anti-Zionism. What I've noticed increasingly is a return of what I would call the American Jewish whisper. Now, those of you who are of my generation will recall that when our parents would speak in a public space and use the word Jew, the voice lowered several octaves. Didn't matter what the topic was. You say the word Jew, you whisper. And what I've noticed over the last few decades in my trips back to America is that the American Jewish whisper disappeared, certainly in the younger generation. Well, it's back. It's back on campus. I just experienced it. I was with Jewish students. We're walking on the quad, and as soon as one of them mentioned Jew or Israel, the American Jewish whisper returned. And so that is what really needs to be fought. And truly, I know I've abused the rabbi's goodwill. I'm going to conclude now, really conclude. And that is that the relationship that we need to develop between us has to deepen on many levels. It needs to not only function on a political level of support, critique, but it needs to develop on a much more organic, cultural, shared cultural language. The rabbi and I were speaking about our shared love of Israeli music. That music doesn't only belong to Israelis. So much of Israeli music that's being created today is actually Jewish music, Jewish themes that have nothing to do with the specificity of Israeli life. This is music that belongs to the whole of the Jewish people. And so what we're really looking at is taking a relationship that has never been equal and trying to make this relationship more equal, more nuanced, and built on mutual respect. And if we succeed in doing that, then I believe we will be taking a major step forward in the future of the Jewish people. Thank you.
Thank you, Yossi. And believe it or not, that was not the first time that someone has gone over his allotted time on the bima in our sanctuary. Not that we're naming names or anything.
What you're talking about.
So a lot to think about and a lot to discuss. We have some time for some questions and conversation. So if you would like to ask a question of Yossi, raise your hand, and Rabbi Wexler and I will come around. Just that quick reminder that we're asking questions, and the sermons stay on the bima, and we have a chance to be in dialogue a little bit. Rabbi Wexler, why don't you start over there, then I'll come on over here.
Hello? Hi. Hi, my name is Bettina Dunn. I'm from Northeast Philadelphia. A question. I was wondering what you could tell us about the Israeli citizens that are still being held in Gaza. It became a little bit more public during the last conflict. I understand one of the people is a Ethiopian Jew. I remember when Gilad Shalit was held captive, we heard all about it. It was all over the place. There was all kinds of, I must have signed 1 million petitions, et cetera, but these other people, we've heard absolutely nothing except for the little bit I saw online on Facebook during the conflict.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could enlighten us on that. Thank you for having
I
a good day.
appreciate the question. Part of what's happened to the Israelis who are being held in Gaza, I think there are 2 of them, is Gilad Shalit backlash. The Gilad Shalit trade, over 1,000 terrorists for Shalit, was very popular for about a week in Israel. Israelis were so moved, and this was an expression of our national solidarity, and Israel is a family. Very, very quickly, many Israelis became disillusioned with the deal and felt that we had laid the groundwork for opening ourselves up to endless blackmail, terror blackmail. And it became clear within a couple of years of the trade-off that that deal cost the lives of a number of Israelis, because some of the released terrorists returned to terrorism. And so the question became, is it moral? Do we have the right to make those kinds of trade-offs? And so there's a great deal of Gilad Shalit fatigue in Israel. That's the part of the story that hasn't been told abroad. But I think most Israelis feel it. And certainly this government is headed by political leaders who are very critical of Netanyahu for making that deal. And that's part of the difficulty of what's happening today. And I think that the days when the Israeli public would be mobilized for a campaign, as it was for Shalit, are over. And it's just not going to happen that way anymore. There are negotiations for a trade-off, but what Hamas wants, Hamas expects the Shalit deal to be the benchmark. That is not going to happen, and that's why there's a deadlock.
Thank you. We have another question over here.
Yes, Yossi. When people talk about negotiating with the Palestinians, people think of them as a single entity. But of course, you have the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank, you have Hamas in Gaza, and then you have many other groups that are much more radical than Hamas. Who exactly are the Israelis supposed to negotiate with? And if in fact they come up with something with the Palestinian Authority, will Hamas abide by that? Will the more radical groups abide by that? Who exactly is Israel supposed to negotiate with?
Did you all understand the question through the mask? Okay. So my answer is that I'm waiting for a Palestinian leader who will tell his people the truth, which is that there's not going to be a return of the descendants of refugees from 1948 to the state of Israel. And Mahmoud Abbas came very close to making that statement. I think it was in 2012. He was asked by an Israeli reporter, you are a refugee from Tzfat, the Israeli northern city of Tzfat. Do you consider Tzfat to be Israel or Palestine? And Abbas said, I consider it to be Israel. And he said, do you believe that you have the right to return to Tzfat? And he said, I don't have the right to return, but I have the right to visit. And when I heard that, I was galvanized. I said, finally, this is the Palestinian leader that we were waiting for. And I am coming to an answer to your question. And within 1 or 2 days, there was such an uproar in Palestinian society against Abbas that he retracted and the statement became meaningless. So the moment that we hear a Palestinian leader making that breakthrough statement and holding it is the moment when I believe we need to start negotiating. And the result will likely be a civil war among Palestinians. Sometimes a civil war is unavoidable. We had a mini civil war in Israel when Menachem Begin brought the Altalena, the arms ship, in, and Ben-Gurion fired on the Altalena off the coast of Tel Aviv and sank it. It was only Begin's restraint that prevented a civil war. If Begin hadn't been the national leader that he was, we would have, God forbid, had a civil war. In 1948, 3 years after the Holocaust, we would have had a civil war. And so I think a Palestinian civil war is unavoidable. And Ben-Gurion's argument, which I also understand, was that a state can only have one source of military authority. You can't have another group bringing weapons in. And so Ben-Gurion took the kind of hard decision that he knew how to make. And if there's ever going to be a Palestinian state, they're going to have to do something similar. They're going to have to take on the forces that are vying for control. Whether Hamas or Fatah will win, whether Fatah is a partner or not. Certainly today, I don't believe Fatah and the PA is a partner for a permanent peace. Down the road, as we say in the Middle East, God is great. So, who knows?
Great to hear his perspective. You hit on a couple of things in what you were talking about at first. I've always seen the American presidency with a duality. There's national policy, international policy, and I agree with you. I've always had a problem with the way that Obama was internationally, but domestically, you kind of have those both feelings. And the same thing with Trump. I didn't have so much of a problem with how Trump dealt with Israel, yet had big problems with what he did here. Knowing that, and I guess those are my real question is, how does Israel feel about Biden and the administration now, and the current feeling that Israelis have towards current American policy? And things are kind of obviously changing with the new, and then East Jerusalem and things like that. So I just want to get your perspective there.
Well, I think that Afghanistan, the way in which the retreat happened, sent Israelis into a deep, deep state of anxiety. And can we really depend on this administration? I don't believe so. I think most Israelis have concluded that we can't. In terms of other issues, for me, the main issue remains Iran. That will determine whether we will be in relative harmony with this administration or in active opposition. And I don't know. I don't know. In terms of the Palestinian question, look, I think there'll be some tension if the administration reopens, excuse me, if the administration reopens the American consulate in Jerusalem for the Palestinians. I think that will be seen as an unfriendly act that is redividing Jerusalem. But I don't see that as a major source of crisis. It's more, that's a more symbolic issue than a practical issue. The real divide will be Iran, and the question is whether the U.S. will go back to the deal or not. And if they go back to the deal without winning any additional concessions, in other words, if the deal is resurrected the way it was negotiated in 2015, even though Iran in the last few years has significantly increased its enriched uranium, and that's not taken into account, and we just go back and pretend it's still 2015, Israel and our Arab allies will see that as a direct threat, and we will deal with that. Thank you. We will deal with it, and I believe that we will have military intervention, even if the rest of the world is against us. The irony is, much of the Arab world will be with us. And how crazy is that? That America, the administration, might be against us, and Saudi Arabia will be with us.
We have another question over here.
Thank you very much for your thoughts tonight. Very helpful. My name is David Bross. You only touched on this at the end of your talk, but you mentioned that you were on campus with some students. What I'd like to hear from you are your thoughts and ideas as to how to get the younger generation of Jews, very few of whom are in this room tonight, and at every event, it's rare to see anybody under age 50. How do we get them to engage or re-engage with their Jewish identities and affirm their connection to Israel?
So I really appreciate the question. And forgive the self-promotion that I'm about to make. But I wrote a book a few years ago called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which was aimed at two audiences. The first audience, the most immediate audience, were my Palestinian neighbors. The book was translated into Arabic and placed online for free downloading in Arabic and offered for Arabic readers throughout the Middle East. But the second audience were your kids. And I was really hoping that young American Jews would eavesdrop on my conversation with my Palestinian neighbors. And I had initially thought of writing a second book called Letters to a Young American Jew. That's a book that nobody would have read with a title like that. And I eventually realized that much of what I needed to say to my Palestinian neighbor, I also needed to say to young American Jews. about who we are, why Israel matters. And so I hope that some of those questions are useful for young American Jews. And what I try to do in that book is really offer a new language of speaking about Israel, because the truth is that we are still largely speaking about Israel in a 20th century language. And we're speaking about Israel as a place of refuge for the Jewish people. And that was very much the 20th century story. It's not the 21st century story. Zionism was the meeting point of Jewish need for refuge and Jewish longing, 2,000 years of longing for a land that we lost but never forfeited. An extraordinary story of a people keeping faith with a missing land, a land that it believed it would one day return to. There's no example of this in history. A people losing its land and 2,000 years refusing to accept reality. And then even more astonishingly, 2,000 years later, actually returning. That's the story we need to start telling. The more we tell a story that's grounded in the Holocaust and the pogroms of Russia, the more we invite the understandable pushback by Palestinians and their supporters of why should the Palestinians have paid the price for what Europe did to the Jews. And so we are telling a story that is actually counterproductive. And there's another aspect here. When we tell a Holocaust-centric story about Israel, we're telling a Eurocentric Jewish story that writes off more than half of Israel's Jewish population, which did not come from Europe. It came from one part of the Middle East and settled in another part of the Middle East. And that's a story that we need to be telling. And so the story that my generation grew up on, understandably, a story of Holocaust and rebirth, is not a story that can work in the same way. The transmission needs to be updated. But that's just really the beginning of what we need, of what needs to be a very substantive conversation.
I'll just add briefly to that, and I see one hand going up perhaps, which is this year, inspired by Yossi's visit, but also by these types of conversations with our 11th and 12th graders at TBS, we're reading Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor with that sense in mind. We have some of our students here tonight. I know we have more on the live stream as well. And like we did in the community Beit Midrash a couple years ago, we're devoting time to read through it and studying it and talking about some of these questions. And I think so far our first couple classes have been pretty good. Right, guys? All right, thanks, Robert. Good. We have time for a couple other questions.
Yossi, I was delighted to hear that you were coming tonight. I've been following your writings for the last 30 years at least. Okay, and one of the things that you've expressed is the role of religion in the conflict, and that Judaism and Islam are not in conflict in most cases, although it can be made to be in conflict if you work at it hard enough. Can you discuss a little bit about your thoughts on the use of religion to help bridge some of the conflicts?
Well, I really appreciate the question, and this is something that I've been increasingly preoccupied with, because religion in the Middle East can either be part of the problem or can help heal the problem. And right now, religion is very much part of the problem. And so there's an understandable tendency among many people to try to circumvent religion. The problem with that is that in the Middle East, you can't avoid religion. There's no bypass to religion. And if we're going to try to reach a compromise between Israel and the Palestinians, we will need some religious imprimatur, some religious legitimization for the compromises, the painful compromises that each side is going to have to make. And one of the great failures of the Oslo process of the 1990s, among many failures, was the absence of input by religion, by religious authorities. The Oslo peace process was a process entrusted into the hands of secular elites on both sides. Certainly in the Middle East, in the Arab world, religion is essential, and increasingly in Israel as well. Israel is nowhere near as secular as it once was. And in order for the two sides, first of all, to see each other as potential partners, we need to stop seeing each other's religion as a threat and an obstacle, and instead seeing it as an opportunity. And I learned that this is possible through my work with Palestinians. I wrote letters to my Palestinian neighbor from a religious perspective. I wrote it as a religious Jew speaking to a religious Muslim. And some of the responses that I got from Palestinians expressed gratitude for hearing an Israeli perspective, a Zionist narrative, coming from a religious perspective. And one guy wrote to me saying, I was never able to hear a Zionist narrative before. It made me too angry. But when I heard you as a religious person reaching out and speaking about Zionism, I was able for the first time to open myself to that. So that for me was a kind of a vindication that this intuitive sense that I've had for a long time, that religion must be brought in to peacemaking, really is the way that we need to go. Now, obviously, there's the peace will be negotiated by diplomats, but next time around, I would like to see religious leaders at the table. I would also like to see therapists. I'd like to see poets, historians. I think that we really need to broaden the texture of peacemaking. It can't be left only to the diplomats. They don't have the emotional tools that we need to make peace. So thank you for that question.
So I'm going to ask a question that's actually on behalf of Robert Kilsdonk, who is a member of our 11th, 12th grade class. He's a 12th grader currently reading your book. And we were having a very nuanced conversation over here about nuance. And he's wondering, being a young person trying to engage in conversations around Israel with his peers, many of whom perhaps don't appreciate or can't see the nuance in the way that we're trying to talk about it tonight. He's wondering how can he and all of us engage in that conversation and encourage others to come from it from a perspective of nuance.
So I really appreciate the question. I'm afraid, though, that it goes deeper than the conversation on Israel, because one of the deepest problems that I feel on campuses is a culture of intolerance of another point of view. And there's this growing fear, kind of an authoritarian fear of stepping out of what is permitted to be said. And when people become afraid to speak, and I saw a poll recently, something like 60% of Americans of both political persuasions say that they're afraid to totally speak honestly about what they think. Now that's a disaster. And so we're really looking at a systemic cultural problem. The conversation on Israel is one casualty of that. The need to not only choose sides, but to do so in the most the most intolerant way, in a way that precludes any conversation. And I was telling some people before that I spoke the other day at the University of Illinois, and I was there with an Arab-Israeli friend, and when he got up to speak, 40 pro-Palestinian students stood up and walked out, and they were holding signs saying, no normalization of genocide. And my response in the comments that I made afterwards was that there are two cultures at war in this room today. And it's not Islam versus Judaism, and it's not Palestinians versus Israelis. It's a culture of cancellation and boycott versus a culture of conversation and dialogue. And those are the two camps. And you'll find liberals and conservatives in both camps. And the camp that I believe that we as Jews need to uphold, because that's our 4,000-year tradition, is a culture of conversation, of respectful argument. All of Talmudic Judaism is argument, is discussion. That's what the Beit Midrash is, the study hall. If you take away conversation, you've basically taken away Rabbinic Judaism. And so where we need to stand is affirming the culture, the culture of the Beit Midrash, of the traditional Jewish study hall, which was a culture of modeling how to disagree and still be sitting around the same table.
So I have our last question over here, and then we'll have a chance to talk a little more in the social hall.
Hi, thank you again for coming out. This is really great conversation. And I just wanted to ask, we talked about America's change in government and change in presidency. I wanted to flip that question on its head and just ask you, you mentioned a little about Israel's new government. If you could just say a few words about maybe how that fits in historically. Are there reasons for optimism, and maybe are there ways we should temper our optimism and preserve that? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the question. This is the strangest government that we've ever had. We've had strange governments in Israel. This may be the strangest democratic government that any country has ever had. I can't think of another government that has brought together the hard right, which is Naftali Bennett's party, the hard left, which is Meretz, to say nothing of the center in the middle here, that has brought together an anti-Arab party, which was Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party, which was out and out anti-Arab, together not just with an Arab party, but an Islamist party. It's really a crazy government. And yet, I think this is maybe the best government that we've ever had, or certainly the most interesting, or at the very least, the best possible government that we could have at this time. Because what this government models is the exact opposite of what the Netanyahu government represented. Netanyahu was all about divisiveness, inciting right-wing Jews against left-wing Jews, inciting Israeli Jews against Israeli Arabs. Netanyahu thrived on discord, schism. And this is a government that is modeled on the opposite premise, that ultimately what unites Israelis is more important than what divides us. It's an astonishing experiment. And many of us in Israel who supported this government have been holding our breaths since it came into power. And we would, I remember in the early weeks of the government, every Shabbat, I would celebrate. I would say, we made it another week, because this government is so fragile. It has a parliamentary majority of 1, which means any one member of the 61 governing coalition can turn against the government and bring it down. And so it's a really, really fragile situation. But that's Israel. You know, Israel is a roller coaster. We find ourselves, you know, I was among those who went out to demonstrate against Netanyahu. And I'm a former Netanyahu voter. And I have great respect and appreciation for what he did for the country up until the last few years. And I had never imagined that I would be going out and demonstrating against him. But I did. I joined the demonstrations, these weekly demonstrations outside his home. And so to go from that state of feeling that the country is falling apart to suddenly seeing the most improbable example of national unity that we've ever had in our history. And that's Israel. You know, we're a country of extremes. We go from one reality to the next. In May, Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis were literally killing each other in the streets. In June, we created the first joint Arab-Jewish governing coalition in Israel's history. That's Israel. And so, am I optimistic? Absolutely not. Israelis are not optimists, but we do have great hope. Israelis are a people of hope. And the difference between optimism and hope is that optimists believe that things will get better, and people who have hope they'll get better, and know that terrible things can happen. And we are a people, I think, of deep hope, and that's what sustains us. That's what has helped us get to this point, and I believe that that's what's going to keep pulling us through. So thank you all very much.
So thank you again to Yossi, and thank you to everyone for all of your questions. We're going to be heading in a moment to the Friedman Social Hall, where there is going to be some refreshments for those who would like. We do ask that you keep your masks on, but of course when you're eating you can sit and take them off. That's fine. We'll also be selling copies of Yossi's book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. If you have not read it, you need a copy. We highly recommend it. Those will be on sale there too. And Yossi will be there ready to sign books that you've brought or other things or books that you've purchased as well. I want to say thank you again to all of our supporters and to the JCRC and everyone who helped make this program possible. For those of you who know someone who missed it or someone who you'd love to show this to, we will have a recording available that we'll post on our website and we'll circulate that we'll make available for the community. And so you're welcome to share it with others as you would like. So once again, thank you very much to Yossi and to Sarah for being here and for being with us. And Lila Tov, thank you everyone for being here.